Telefilm data shows 2025 was one of the worst years this decade for Canadian films at the box office. Only 2020 and 2022 were worse. So why aren't Canadians turning out for Canadian movies? Sonya Yokota William is the founder and director of the network of independent Canadian exhibitors. Francesca Accinelli is Chief Program Officer at Telefilm Canada. And Noah Segal is the co-president of Elevation Pictures. Great to have you both in our studios. Sonya, great to have you on the line. Francesca, I'm going to come to you first. Telefilm Canada released data earlier this year showing a nearly 41% drop in box office revenue for Canadian films last year. What do you attribute that decline to?
I think I'd like to start with the positive. I'd like to start with the fact that we had at least 2 Canadian films that hit over $1 million. We had Night of the Zoopocalypse and we had The Keeper, and then we also had Montes in Quebec. Canada's experiencing what the rest of the world is experiencing. Independent cinema is trying to find its place. It's trying to find its place in cinemas as well as online. And for us, our access to screens in Canada is sometimes limited. So it takes those few titles to kind of punch through, create the excitement, find its audience. What we know is when Canadian films find their audiences, people will come and see them in the cinemas. So yes, global trend. Not everybody wants to get off their seats and come into the cinemas. You have many options at home. But boy, when you find the films that connect with them, they will show up. They will connect with the filmmakers, they'll connect with the actors, and they want to see their stories on screen. So decline maybe, but I think we're on a positive trend.
Sonya, I'll get your take on there as well.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think the number is bad. I think all of us thought that when we saw the 40%. And I also think, you know, look, there's going to be years where the movies hit and years where they don't. Frankly, you know, as Francesca alluded to, Hollywood hasn't been looking too great over the past couple of years either. You know, Cineplex was also making headlines earlier this year because their profits were down nearly 90% in Q4 2025. And that was largely due to the lack of big Hollywood blockbusters, films not performing the way that we thought they would. And 90%, that's way higher than 40%. And, you know, we're not coming together to talk about the quality of those films. So, you know, I think everyone has an opinion on how to make a big film that's going to draw in a bunch of people, and many of those same people try and fail. And in our business, that's just kind of the way that these things happen. So, you know, from my perspective, from the Network of Independent Canadian Exhibitors, from the cinema perspective, when I see that 40% number, what stands out to me is there's no clarity kind of within that number. So, you know, in Canada, we're very familiar with market concentration, and I would like to kind of introduce to your audience the fact that Cineplex has a 75% box office market share in this country. So, you know, for context, Loblaws has, you know, up to 30% market share, and we've been talking about Loblaws since the pandemic lockdowns. So if we're saying, you know, Canadian film is 40% down, then you just take a zoom out and say, you know, 75% of that total gross number that we're taking from is attributed to Cineplex. So I think if we want to improve this number, we kind of need to know where the growth is and where we can do better. And also kind of ask the question, also like Francesca was saying, like, were many Canadians even given the opportunity to watch a Canadian film on the big screen in the last year?
All right. No, I'll get your thoughts on the numbers
look,
there.
I completely agree with what Sonya said and what Fran said about some of the things going on. I think that is a misnomer, the 41%. It's too vague a number, and the way it was presented is just, it's odd. The truth of the matter is that we are two solitudes in Canada. We're a French market and an English market. Right. And in Quebec, they really had the biggest pain this last year. The English market's only down like 5%. So that 41%, when you do that calculation, you really see that the problem was that Quebec films weren't hitting. English films were with a marginal discount. The truth is we're not a massive proportion of the entire cinema market. But whatever we are, it was a marginal drop, and you're already seeing a massive increase flip in the first quarter of this year. So in fact, I would argue when you do the numbers this year, we're going to be up in English market probably 10 or 15%. So there's going to be a natural up and down. This doesn't discount the fact that Hollywood's had its ups and downs, and you know, the world has changed to some extent. But the real reality is Canadians are going to Canadian films. It's English Canadians for sure, and Quebecers just experienced what English Canadians had felt for a long time, which is that Hollywood came back with a vengeance last year in the summer with the major studios providing content that people wanted to see. And I think when they started putting out their films in Quebec, assuming they were sort of inoculated against people going to one or the other, as Franny said, they weren't. I mean, they were going to see Sinners. They were going to see One Battle After Another.
Right.
Films that actually were studio films, but kind of took a letter out of the independent landscape and got that audience to move over. So I think that's where Quebec got hit, and I think they've already started to learn their lesson. But English Canada, I'd say it's really not the right note. 41% is not a very accurate assessment at all. It's a 5% dip, which is very, very, we can definitely galvanize ourselves against that.
You said a word in there in your response, the word hit, and I want a better understanding of what a hit is. Francesca, what does a Canadian film have to earn to be considered a success?
I think that's a complicated question. Telefilm actually, we're trying to redefine what a hit looks like and what does success look like. We've just talked about box office. Telefilm used to be measured by box office. And I don't think it's necessarily realistic to use box office alone. And so what we're trying to do is expand, if a film that we invest in can actually find its audience, whether it's in cinemas, whether it's online, whether it's community screenings, that should be deemed a success. And we're working towards measuring that to be able to say, if I can find, if my film is set in Sudbury and I connect with the people of Sudbury and they see themselves on screen, we need to say that that is a success. Independent cinema, authentic stories, when they find their audience, that, for me, as an investor in most of Canadian cinema, that is what we're trying to hit. That being said, we live in a, film as an economic driver. And I'm going to look to Noah, but I think, for us in English Canada, if we can hit 1 million, in terms of box office, that's successful.
Okay.
And I think I'm excited to see, and we'll, maybe talk about it later, but we've got some films that are hitting that number. And what I'm excited by is now that we do have NICE as an organization, our independent cinemas are really starting to play a bigger and bigger role in contributing to that audience engagement and that box office success.
All right, well, let's talk about a movie. Nirvana, the band, the show, the movie is one example of an English-Canadian movie that's done really well. Noah, what do you attribute its success to?
How wacky the movie is. No, first and foremost, it comes to the movie. And the movie is ridiculously funny and over the top. They're incredibly talented filmmakers. And historically, I'll give you like a little sidebar. Usually we buy a movie off a script and the talent attachments and everything like that. When Matt, the producer, co-writer, and the other Matt Johnson, the director and co-writer and star, came to pitch us, they pitched us a movie entirely different, no script, from what we actually got. We had no idea what movie we were getting until they delivered
a little unusual, I imagine.
But it surpassed everything we thought it was going to be. And they're a tremendous talent to work with. So the movie was really fun. And on a very crass level, it's 4-quadrant. There's nothing in that movie that will not allow...
What do you mean by that?
4-quadrant means everybody can see it.
Okay.
Men, women, young, old. You can bring a family to that movie and not be insulted. There's nothing in that movie that would be offensive.
Okay.
So it's entertaining, funny, adventurous, crazy, unexpected, and available. Okay? On top of that, to what Franny was saying, it's community-based. There's a ton in that movie that is very localized to Canada, not just Toronto. They do things off the CN Tower, which is in the trailer, which is very localized, but sort of a national sort of place, artifice. But on top of that, they go into Canadian Tire. So it's got this real vibe of like Canadians can relate to it and be about the history of Toronto and the history of a Canadian city in the context of a crazy, wacky comedy adventure. The reason it was so successful beyond that is the talent was available. We learned this with Marty Supreme, with Timothée Chalamet doing his ridiculous videos online and doing all the crazy stunts he did for Marty Supreme, which drove that film to some form of success. These guys did a very similar thing. Matt and Jay were everywhere. They were at screenings, meeting talent, not just at random locations. We had merch available that they did signings of. They were totally available to their fan base. And they were everywhere. They did stuff on digital that was ridiculous, that was in support of the film. And then we promoted the film with a ton of advertising dollars. So we picked the right time of year. We had the talent supportive. We had a major barrage of marketing and then merch. and we had a movie to back it up that delivered on the promise. So you have all those things going in, and we had a real hit. And to Franny's point, it's exceeding that. It's already in its 11th or 12th week in theater. It's not receding. It's still going. And in terms of Sonya's thing, the film came out and did well in Cineplex, but the #2 cinema was an independent cinema.
All right.
So you have a situation where the community got behind it. They went to their community screen to watch this, and they still are. So we're ecstatic with the success of that film.
Well, and it's also, if I can say, it's also authentic. Like, I think one of the things that we see now more than ever, and forgive me, but I've been around a long time. We used to have trends where we tried to model ourselves after the Americans, and for some genres, some topics that works. But we're seeing more and more with Nirvana. We're seeing it even with Undertone and others. When we're actually leaning into our unique voice, our Canadian voice, our perspective, it actually amplifies it. That's what this generation, I think, this Gen Z or whatever, I think that's what they're called, whatever my children are, but that's what they want. They want authentic. They want authentic voices. They can get copycat anywhere else, and that's what's so exciting about the Matt Squared, as I call them, because they are authentically themselves, and you go on the ride with them, and that's what's magical right now.
Sonya, I'll get your take on there and sort of the role of independent exhibitors in sort of these successes and hits here.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that with the large titles, of course, you're going to have your really big performing cinemas that can carry a film for a long time, these independent stalwarts in the big city centers. And that's where the big titles. I also feel like for Canadian film, a really crucial role that independent cinemas play is really elevate the small local film, the films that maybe, don't open all across Canada, but will open, in just BC cinemas and really resonate with their local community. And so, for me personally, one of my favorite films is Seagrass, a Canadian film from 2023. And that's about growing up with, a half Japanese family in the west coast of BC. And, that's my childhood. And so for me, that was a film of very high quality. And I feel like that film and that middle amount of film, these indie films that I think are growing in cultural resonance, those are very well served by the independents.
All right, let's talk a little controversy. Sonya, I want to ask you first, because you brought up Cineplex. I want to get your reaction on comments the president and CEO of Cineplex, Ellis Jacob, made recently about the slump. He said, the awareness is a little lower, but it's also the quality of the content. It's not bringing droves of people to the theaters. Should mention, we did invite Ellis Jacob to join us, but Cineplex did decline. Sonya, your thoughts? We will talk about awareness, but I think the word that hurts, I think, is quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the question that comes to mind for everyone who hears that is, what is the definition of quality? I highly doubt that Ellis Jacob watched all 100+ Canadian films that came out last year. And I think what we can take from that statement is what he means is the money-making potential of these movies, right? So one that does raise the question that Fran brought up earlier is like, do we want to assess films on the basis of dollars and cents? But for me, once again, pulling back, I really think the crux of this is, it's one thing for the average person to say, oh, I don't think Canadian films are of high quality. I do think it's a problem if the leader of the organization that's responsible for 75% of the money made by selling movie tickets in this country is making a blanket statement about the economic viability of Canadian films. I do think that this is just like a natural consequence of market concentration where, we kind of, by nature of this concentration of, power and economic generation, we're able to have one person kind of determine in some ways the economic viability of Canadian films. So I think really what's important here is the structural aspect of like, how did we end up in this situation where we've devoted such a large portion of our cultural landscape to just one company?
Noah?
Yeah, I would echo some of those things. I think the thing is you have to understand context. I think if Ellis would have added, but we'll still give access for Canadian film in our cinemas, because Sonya's right. Look at it like a broadcaster with limited slots. And so we need those slots at those cinemas. We need to have the ability to place those movies in, and we need to have a runway to promote those movies so the consumer can know they're there. So we need cash to do it, to make sure they can hear us. We need the slot, and we need that guaranteed. And I think Ellis, to his credit, would say the exact same comment to Disney when one of their films disappoints too. The quality's not there. And I'm sure they would complain too, saying that we make good stuff. I agree with Sonya. Quality to him is just the quality of putting a movie in my cinema and getting 90% occupancy. That's what he's talking about. And that's all and frankly, that's what he should talk about, because we need to make sure it's viable, right? We may as a community like to make movies. We got to make sure consumers want to see those movies. So what defines art is not just us, but it's what they want to see. So I wouldn't come down too hard on him as long as he commits to making sure that there's slots there and he's not making it difficult for independent cinema to exist too, which Ellis is a seasoned guy. He understands that there is a quid pro quo. We have to make room for content and we have to allow it to be placed. And I think that's the biggest battle that has to go on behind doors, is making sure those movies get places.
I actually want to read another quote, so I'll get you to respond on that, but I also want to read something from the Globe and Mail's film editor, Barry Hertz. He wrote, "The sheer amount of Canadian movies produced and released each year also underlines the fundamental problem with this country's perpetually in crisis film industry. Can anyone, even the head of Telefilm, name 50 Canadian movies from 2025? How about 25? 10? We do not have a Canadian movie crisis so much as we have a crisis of Canadian movie awareness." Francesca, are we doing enough to promote Canadian films?
No, I think, no, done, why? I think it's twofold. I think at Telefilm right now, we are taking a step back and saying, are we part of the problem? I mean, producers and distributors may not want to hear it, but I think we are maybe investing in too many films. But at the same time, we need to make sure that this industry remains viable and stable. So often, we want to invest in a film that maybe is not going to have a cinematic release. It'll do a festival, and and then it will find its place on a platform. So I think one of the things is, Barry is right. I think that not all films are made equal. And I think the film industry often wants them to be equated equal. Of those 100 films, every single one wanted to have a 30 to 50 screen release and be selected for TIFF. This is not what every film is going to experience, but we do have to get better at supporting them along the way. One of the things that Telefilm has done is outside of the marketing. So, just in Ontario, we invested more than $6 million of our $10 million marketing budget to Ontario films. Of that, some of it was this audience engagement initiative that distributors, like Elevation, we would give a bit more, which was a grant, not investment, so no money at risk, to encourage more risk taking. It's a lot. They're investing, we're investing, and we're never going to, do the American take the budget and take half and have a $50 million campaign. We are, for the most part, a grassroots industry. And if I kind of connect it back to this idea of predictability in the cinemas, independent films, most of them they don't have key casts that people know. They're not necessarily stories that are gonna pop. So you need time. You need to be like the band's gonna be there in a month, and you have that time to friends and family and do what, the Matt and Jay did. We don't have that predictability. And I think that's part of, what NICE is trying to do. Sometimes Cineplex does, but you can't promote if you don't know where you're gonna promote to. You can promote, but if you don't have a place to say, and let's show up on this day. So I think it's hand in hand. We have to maybe reduce how many things we're investing in. Please don't freak out, everybody, but I think it's important. And then we have to better support at a promotional side, but people have to know where to be able to see it.
Yeah, I think adding to that, I think look, we did a sort of a rough justice analysis of the business. So you have, let's say, on average, 4 films that come out a week in theaters-ish, North America. Then you have 50 weeks or so in a year, so you're looking at 200 films that come out a year. We did sort of an analysis of what was available to the independent space, not just of those films, that actually make any impression on consumer. Let's say over $2 or $3 million in box office in the US, meaning they open New York, LA, or New York, LA, Toronto, Vancouver, and people actually remembered them for 15 seconds, okay? It's about 25 films. in North America that get that. So one every 2 weeks that a consumer might go, hey, I might take a chance on that instead of seeing Star Wars. Okay?
Yep.
We have a long tradition in Canada supporting everybody. I'm with Franny. It's a bit misleading. So I agree that there's a crossover of culture and enterprise that has to be addressed, but let's be real. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around to hear it, does it really make a noise? We have to be, with culture, we have to be aware that the constituents actually find it culturally valuable. And I think when you see that consumers are getting off their butts and going to see a film every 2 weeks that's not a major motion picture, we have to be limiting and we have to pick our shots. It's like, if I can make another analogy, it's like being in the sports business and you have a small market team. You got to play Moneyball sometimes.
Right.
And I think that for those that don't know, that means if you don't have $1 billion to get LeBron James, you have to get Schmubron James and hope that he delivers and be realistic about what you're trying to achieve. And sometimes you don't take a shot at something you know is not going to be there. And so we're a big advocate of taking bigger, better shots, but also not ignoring, not just do it because you think it might be culturally appropriate, but you gotta respect that the market has to acknowledge that your movie means something. So I'm a big believer in what Barry said. I think we as Canadians have been on we've been living in a la-la land thinking we can just keep putting, because we're not talking a couple $100,000 here. Each movie is millions of dollars. Right. And as a consumer, as a taxpayer, it's gotta be culturally relevant and economically viable. Right. I'm sorry, but if we don't get there, if we aren't making more Nirvanas, we're not doing it.
All right. Sonya, you get the last word on this.
I mean, from my perspective, from the audience perspective, I do have some good news, which is that independent and smaller films globally are doing better than ever. The global independent box office grew 41% in 2025. That's from this group, Indie Film Library, that does these calculations every year. And the Gen Z cinema audience jumped 25% last year. It's the biggest increase of any demographic. Gen Z now represents 39% of the total movie-going audience in North America. So I think we hear a lot of doom and gloom, just big picture in terms of what's the future of cinema, but we are actually seeing these smaller titles find more audiences. I think what we're seeing is kind of the end of these large, major blockbusters filling multiplexes 365 days of the year. But what we might be seeing is actually a much better world for Canadian film and these smaller titles that might resonate more geographically or to a particular community.
What a lovely note. The future is bright, is what I hear. Since it's National Canadian Film Day, I do have to ask very quickly, I'm just going to go around the block. What's one Canadian film you would recommend viewers to go see in the theater? Sonya, I'm starting with you.
Oh, coming out soon is Blue Heron, which is just a beautiful, experimental, emotional story of a family in British Columbia. It's coming out shortly. It's actually being distributed in the US, I believe, from this weekend, and I highly recommend it.
Noah?
I'm going to be very biased because I'm going to pick the stuff that we do. So there's a couple. Mile End Kicks is coming up, which is a pretty cool downtown Montreal story of a gal who's trying to figure out her life. And it's pretty hip. It's got a lot of music in it. And it's very funny. And it's got Barb from Euphoria in it, and Jay Baruchel's in it, and Deb Bostic. And then also we have a film coming out in the fall, and Sons, that Sarah Polley wrote, that has a bunch of cast from the UK. Bill Nighy, Noah Segal, George McKay, Johnny Flynn, Imelda Staunton, etc. And it's a great, great sort of dramedy about getting old and trying to make a place in your life.
All right, I know this one's going to be hard for you.
It's very tough. I can't really pick my favorite, so I'm going to do two things. There is an Indigenous film coming out called In the Place of Ghosts. It's beautiful. It's in Indigenous languages. I know it's coming out very shortly, so I'd recommend that. Please, Indigenous cinema is finding its time. It's incredible. And then for those of you that maybe don't want to venture out, 40 Acres. 40 Acres, shot in Sudbury. We just looked at the stats. It is number 4 on Netflix in the Caribbean and in Latin America. It is finding its audience, and no one is promoting it. This is just, it's R.T. Thorne. It's done very well. It's playing today in cinemas and has had a nice tour everywhere. So I'm gonna go with those two, but also all the things that
they're all her children.
They're all my children. I love them all equally.
All right, a great place for us to end our conversation. I want to thank you all. This was quite lovely.
Thank you very much for putting
Thank
Canadian
you.
cinema here. We appreciate it.
Appreciate you guys.
Thanks.